Alright, AP Econ, this is your last video on the Phillips curve. In this video we're going to talk about supply shocks, and then we're also going to talk about the cost of disinflation. So go back and look at the last videos if you need to understand the relationship between the Phillips curve and the aggregate supply and demand models. In this video we're going to mainly just look at what happens on the Phillips curve. So whenever we have a supply shock, in general that's going to refer to a negative supply shock. I think the book or the AP test would have to tell you that it's going to be a positive supply shock if it ever was one. But in a negative supply shock, that refers to something when the supply over the course of over the entire macroeconomy, when the supply decreases. The most prevalent historical example we have is in the 1970s. We had the creation of what was called, and is called still today, it's called OPEC. OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They control the supply of oil. The United States is notably not a member of this because we don't have a high enough percentage or high enough volume of oil that we are exporting. In fact, we consume most of the oil that we produce. So OPEC got together in the 1970s. This was Middle Eastern countries as well as Venezuela. And to their credit, they understood that the oil production in the 1970s was at a really high volume. And as you understand, that if there is no competition, then they could just charge higher prices. So that's what they did. They increased the price of oil. And as we know, oil and petroleum, those are input costs. So what we ended up happening in our economy is that supply decreased. And although this is not supply, this is the Phillips curve, which is a mirror image of the supply curve, of the short run aggregate supply curve. And they did this not once, not twice, but this is a bunch of times. They either increased the price by restricting supply, or they charged new fees on top of what was already there. And so what you ended up seeing in the 1970s and early 80s was, I mean, you could see here as we move from point A to point B to point C, we see an increase in inflation. Inflation was quite high. It was over 10% at one point. Just to compare today, it's like about 2% in 2014. So that's ridiculous. That's a really high percentage of inflation for things to cost 10% more from year to year, rather than 2% more from year to year. It's really hard to budget, really hard to loan money at those high of rates. And so this was a problem. These were the result of supply shocks, and just to give you a little context, if we go back to our aggregate supply and demand model, and yes, I'm drawing this tiny, what this would look like is a decrease. Shoot, that was supposed to be red. What this would look like is a decrease in supply. And just to reiterate, this is what we call stagflation. And you see increases in inflation at the cost of decreases in output. So this is pretty negative. That's why they're called negative supply shocks. So what the Fed and the government had to do in the 80s was they had to disinflate the economy. At inflation rates of 10%, it's really easy to just continue those inflation rates and keep them going, but that's not exactly healthy for the economy in the long run. So what there's a Fed chairman, and if you look in your Phillips curve packet, it tells you his name is Paul Volcker. And Paul Volcker in the 1970s and 80s is responsible for the Volcker disinflation. From the years 1979 to 1987, these would be like the different years values for inflation and unemployment. He actually got them to decrease. The rate of inflation actually went down over the course of time. Now this was at a high cost. Let's draw what ended up happening. It's our short run, and here is our long run. We had high rates of inflation, like I said, at 10%, and so what the Fed had to do was to slow down those rates of inflation. So when they what they do in that case is they decrease the money supply. You remember that increasing the money supply increases aggregate demand, which would be a movement up. But when they decrease the money supply, they're moving money out of the economy to slow it down. This really sucks, especially if you're a worker. I mean, as we can see from point A to point B, unemployment has gone up incredibly. People in the early 80s, this was a recession from 1981 to 1982, but what we end up have happening in the long run is a return to lower inflation rates and an increase in employment or a decrease in unemployment. So this was called the Volcker disinflation. And this is a high cost, right? To move from point A to point B to point C. Volcker is not the most famous Fed chairman. He probably had one of the most important jobs in our economy in the last, let's say, 40 years. But he is not exactly a popular figure because laying people off in the short run is going to make you less popular. So this is the Phillips curve, and next chapter, chapter 12, we're going to talk about consumption. Good luck on your chapters 10, 11, and Phillips curve test.